The Bolsheviks quickly realized they had to protect the power they had seized in October 1917. Russia's new rulers created the Extraordinary Commission for Fighting Counter-Revolution and Sabotage. It was known as the Cheka, the shield and sword of the Soviet government. Within a decade, all open resistance was crushed. Those who disagreed with the new regime were killed, forced to emigrate, or imprisoned in labor camps. To attain Stalin's far-reaching goals, Russia would have to pay a high price. His vision of socialism required the slave labor of millions. The state security organization, known as the United States Political Administration, or OGPU, from 1922, turned from suppressing opposition to supplying forced workers for the construction projects of the infamous Gulag. The OGPU's first major project, a canal between the White and Baltic Seas with little practical value, was to demonstrate the awesome potential of the Soviet state. The 141-mile Belomor Canal cut through the harsh terrain of the Russian north. Millions of cubic feet of rock and soil were dug by hand. Dozens of sluices and dams were built in less than 20 months. Even official newsreels documented the horrors. Alexander Solzhenitsyn estimated the mortality rate between convict laborers at 1,000 deaths each day. Within a year, 4 contingents of construction workers had died, only to be replaced. The canal was completed on schedule. The OGPU chiefs proudly notified Stalin before the May Day celebration of 1933. The project surpassed all expectations. Only a quarter of the 400 million ruble budget had been spent. In July, Stalin, Voroshilov, and Kirov traveled along the Belomor Canal. The OGPU supervised other projects. From 1932 to 1937, an 80-mile canal between the Moscow and Volga rivers was built. Working conditions were appalling. This new route linked the Soviet capital with 5 seas and improved its water supply, but at untold human cost. Railroad construction flourished using forced labor. the Gulag prisoners built huge industrial complexes in the Urals, Siberia, and the far north. Convicts helped build the Moscow Metro, an engineering marvel. Official footage only portrayed enthusiastic workers. The riots drew little attention. In 1933, inhuman working conditions in the tunnels led to strikes, which were quashed by the OGPU. The Soviet security organization sought total control over the population. The issuance of internal passports in 1932 was a first step. Only those with perfect records obtained the new documents. The slightest irregularity in one's history led to a prison term. Now the government could also supervise and limit travel. Beyond this, efforts were made to regulate the thoughts and feelings of the Soviet population, the intelligentsia in particular. Lenin had despised the intelligentsia, calling them nothing more or less than dirt. From the early days of the revolution, this social stratum had been under constant Cheka surveillance. Scientists, artists, philosophers, and writers were the first to be exiled, imprisoned, and executed. In 1922, the OGPU deported 200 prominent intellectuals. Those who remained in Russia were in obvious peril. The OGPU agents often falsely gained the confidence of prominent intellectuals. In 1921, Yakov Agranov, an agent known to be involved with poet Nikolai Gumilyov, fabricated a case against him. Gumilyov was denounced as a traitor and shot. Agranov then befriended another poet, Vladimir Mayakovsky. In 1930, Mayakovsky allegedly committed suicide. It still raises many questions, as does the death of another literary genius, Sergei Yesenin. Writer Maxim Gorky was also closely supervised by the OGPU. In 1928, Gorky had accepted an invitation by the Soviet government to return home from Italy. OGPU chief's deputy, Genrikh Yagoda, assumed personal responsibility for Gorky's successful re-entry into Russia and his simultaneous re-education. All Gorky's public appearances were arranged by the OGPU. The people around him, including his cook and gardener, were selected by and controlled by the secret police. They went to extremes to make the Soviet reality seem idyllic to Gorky. He was allowed to live in luxury. Stalin named ships, streets, and cities in his honor and offered him prominent official positions, including Commissar of Education. Stalin hoped that Gorky would express his gratitude by authoring a book flattering to the Soviet leader. In fact, the Soviet system had been acclaimed by some prominent Western writers invited to the USSR, among them Bernard Shaw and Henri Babus. Mysteriously, Babus expired suddenly in Moscow shortly after his book eulogizing Stalin was published. But Gorky would not write a book about the party leader. Unlike the foreign writers, he understood the ramifications of Stalin's socialism. Collectivization of agriculture resulted in a dreadful famine that claimed, even by the underestimated OGPU figures, at least 3.5 million lives. Tension grew between Gorky and Stalin. The writer became isolated. He was not permitted to leave the Soviet Union. In 1934, Gorky succumbed to pressure and agreed to head the Soviet Writers' Union based on the official party initiative. The party and the government eliminate our need to command one another, instead granting us the right to teach. To teach means to exchange experience. Only that. With Gorky as a figurehead, Stalin and OGPU asserted their dominance in the literary field. More than a third of the 600 delegates to the first Soviet Writers' Congress fell victim to the horrors of the secret police. In 1936, Gorky died. According to official sources, his doctor's negligence caused his death. Historians blame the OGPU. Stalin and the secret police regularly shifted the responsibility for their crimes to absolutely innocent people. 1934 was pivotal. Early in the year, the 17th Party Congress convened. Later, it was called the Congress of Winners, implying internal unity and the absence of dissent. The Congress was a victory for Stalin and his retinue, but not an easy one. The election for the party's Central Committee was a secret ballot. Sergei Kirov, supported by the working men, won a majority. 4 votes were cast against Kirov and 289 against Stalin. Figures kept secret from the Congress. Stalin perpetrated a massive fraud, falsifying the results. Only 3 ballots against him were counted. The OGPU's team of graphologists determined those opposed to Stalin. Stalin's aide, Nikolai Yezhov, and his subordinates blacklisted the dissenters. Shortly afterwards, the chairman of the OGPU, Vyacheslav Menjinsky, died. He was buried with honors. His staff and many party members suspected he had been poisoned by his deputy, Yagoda. Stalin blamed Menjinsky's death on Trotsky's supporters. Genrikh Yagoda became the new chairman. In 1934, Yagoda was 43. An engraver's apprentice, he had become a professional revolutionary. His marriage to the niece of Yakov Sverdlov had ensured a quick rise in the party hierarchy. He had joined the Cheka in 1920. As Menjinsky's deputy, he had supervised all domestic OGPU operations. Stalin never questioned Yagoda's loyalty. Yagoda received control not only of the OGPU, but also the police, frontier guards, camps, prisons, and fire brigades, all subordinated to the newly created structure. People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, the NKVD. Public information about NKVD activities was restricted. Appeals rallying public support for the NKVD were made. Newsreels show frontier guards keeping their vigil along the world's longest land border. All other activities were kept secret. One of Yagoda's first steps was to establish special conferences, punitive bodies with the authority to sign death sentences without even seeing a defendant. The special conferences were nicknamed rapid-fire justice. The state policy of genocide expanded and intensified. Stalin needed a pretext to launch the most enormous campaign of terror in history. On December the 1st, 1934, he received it. Sergei Kirov was fatally shot at party headquarters in Leningrad. Initially, his death was blamed on a madman associated with an imaginary sabotage group. In fact, the assassination was masterminded by the Leningrad department of the NKVD, following Stalin's orders. Proof that an NKVD hitman fired the deadly shot disappeared when all possible witnesses of the killing were executed. Stalin would later accuse his primary political opponents, Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, of Kirov's death. On January the 15th, 1935, both were tried and sentenced to 5 years in the labor camps, although there was no evidence at all of their involvement. The Great Terror had begun. In 1936, the secretary of the party Central Committee, Nikolai Yezhov, began to prepare the first Moscow trial. The defendants were charged with participating in a gigantic anti-Stalinist conspiracy that allegedly linked Zinoviev, Kamenev, and other leaders of the routed opposition with Trotsky. The August 1936 trial ended with the death penalty for all defendants. In the weeks that followed, special NKVD trials sentenced thousands of people considered disloyal to the regime. Many foreign communists living in the USSR were arrested. Yagoda strengthened foreign espionage. The Spanish Civil War gave NKVD agents a perfect opportunity to get rid of the dissenters among the Communist International members. Those foreign communists opposing Stalin, who had recklessly volunteered to fight in Spain, were identified and secretly executed during the hostilities. In the second half of 1936, obeying Stalin's directive, the NKVD prepared for the second Moscow trial. Those arrested were accused as leaders of a parallel center. Allegedly, the center had been planning to launch a campaign of terror in case Zinoviev and Kamenev's conspiracy failed. Among the 17 defendants were Grigory Sokolnikov, a former Minister of Finance, Georgy Pyatakov, once one of the chiefs of heavy industry, Karl Radek, the famous journalist, and others. On January the 30th, 1937, 13 completely innocent people were shot in NKVD cellars. 3 weeks later, People's Commissar for Heavy Industry, Sergo Ordzhonikidze, died suddenly. Stalin's closest associate and a personal friend, he had felt free to take issue with Stalin's decisions. Genrikh Yagoda's absence at Ordzhonikidze's funeral publicly demonstrated Yagoda's loss of power. In October of 1936, the security chief had been demoted to the lowly rank of Commissar for Communication. The new head of the NKVD was Nikolai Yezhov. A chronic alcoholic, he was physically disabled, pathologically cruel, and had a passion for singing. The most dismal period of Soviet history had just begun. The old NKVD staff became Yezhov's first victims. Almost all high-ranking secret police officers from throughout the country were summoned to Moscow, never to return. Yezhov decimated the ranks of Soviet military intelligence. In 1937, the legendary Old Man, alias General Grishin, alias Yan Berzin, head of the Red Army Intelligence Administration, was recalled from Spain and executed. Simultaneously, the NKVD eliminated dozens of their own spies. Unidentified bodies were found in the dark byways of Paris, Geneva, and other cities. In June 1937, the terror struck the Red Army High Command. The most enlightened high-ranking officers, Tukhachevsky, Yakir, Ubarevich, Eidemann, Kork, and others, were accused of an anti-Soviet conspiracy and executed. Less than a year later, the officers who court-martialed Tukhachevsky and his associates were eliminated. Air Force Supreme Commander Yakov Alksnis, Commander of the Far Eastern Army Vasily Blucher, Commander of the Leningrad Military District Pavel Dybenko, and Marshal Alexander Yegorov perished along with tens of thousands of officers of every rank and position. The success of this purge was celebrated at a meeting observing the 20th anniversary of the Soviet security apparatus. Beginning with the Cheka, then the OGPU, and now the NKVD. The gathering was held on December the 20th, 1937, in the Bolshoi Theater. Anastas Mikoyan pronounced, "Every citizen of the USSR is an employee of the NKVD." The anniversary was celebrated throughout the country. Yezhov was awarded the Order of Lenin. Military units, industrial enterprises, and even machines were named in his honor. Fanatically devoted to Stalin, Yezhov redoubled his efforts. The purges of 1937-38 reached Stalin's most loyal supporters. Among them, Commissar of Justice Nikolai Krylenko and former prominent Cheka official Josef Unschlicht. One of the heroes of the October Revolution, Vladimir Antonov Ovseyenko, was recalled from his diplomatic post and shot, as would be former NKVD chairman Yagoda. Yagoda was the principal witness and collaborator in Stalin's crimes, including the murder of Kirov. When Stalin found it difficult to avoid public suspicions about the killing, he lay the blame on the NKVD, led by Yagoda. Suddenly, Yagoda was linked with Trotsky and made responsible for the deaths of Menjinsky and Gorky. Yagoda became one of the primary defendants at the third Moscow trial. Along with him, a Politburo member and theorist, Nikolai Bukharin, Soviet government head Alexei Rykov, Central Committee Secretary Nikolai Krestinsky, Lenin's former deputy, and Christian Rakovsky, a respected Bolshevik and the leader of the Soviet Ukraine. The infamous Andrei Vyshinsky was the prosecutor. Bukharin and Rykov and their accomplices systematically fed information to several foreign intelligence services. German and Polish spies swarmed around Yagoda like flies. Not only did he protect them, he also spied for them himself. As a prosecutor, Vyshinsky dealt with confessions rather than factual evidence. The NKVD would force confessions. Its agents employed the most gruesome tortures without sanction. The only way to avoid torture was suicide. Some dared to take their own lives. Among them were Mikhail Tomsky, Yan Gamanik, and Pyotr Skripnik. Bukharin, Rykov, and the other defendants at the third Moscow trial were doomed. All were shot as enemies of the people. Justice disappeared in the Soviet state, which systematically eliminated the old Bolsheviks and waged war against ordinary people. Everyone's future was dangerously uncertain. The NKVD could arrest anyone, anywhere, at any time. A 1935 law applied criminal responsibility and penalties to everyone over 12 years old. Children could be incarcerated or sentenced to death. The horrors of Yezhov's terror were denounced in the West. Romain Rolland criticized the imprisonment of children. André Gide condemned Stalin's regime as fascist. Even Herbert Wells, who had always sympathized with the Soviet cause, could no longer make favorable comments. But Stalin still had allies. Leon Feuchtwanger, who visited the Soviet Union in 1937, wrote an ode to the Soviet leader. My first impression is that Stalin is absolutely unpretentious. The Soviet people not only respect, but also love him. No one is more worthy a representative of 170 million people. Feuchtwanger was among those who saw socialism as a cure of the ills of the modern world. He much preferred Stalin to Hitler. Stalin was now Russia's absolute master. For him, terror became a commonplace method of state administration. Stalin needed new executioners because it was time to eliminate the witnesses of his most recent crimes. On July the 28th, 1938, Lavrentiy Beria was appointed as Yezhov's deputy. Unlike Stalin's other protégés, Beria was not only a party apparatchik, but also a professional secret police officer. In the early 20s, his guile, insidiousness, and phenomenal energy allowed Beria to quickly build a career in the Georgian Cheka. He was not even 30 when he became its chairman. In 1929, he was appointed the OGPU plenipotentiary for all Transcaucasia. While vacationing in Georgia, Stalin became aware of him. Beria continued to rise, now in the party hierarchy. In 1931, he was appointed the party's first secretary in Georgia, and within only a few years he managed, in Stalin's view, to establish proper order in the republic. In 1937, Beria had become Georgia's dictator, a Stalin on a smaller scale. He destroyed all his opponents, among them Stalin's favorite, Nestor Lakoba, leader of the Abkhazian autonomy. Chosen as Yagoda's successor at the NKVD, Lakoba rejected the appointment. He would not leave Abkhazia, remaining instead to vie with Beria for power in Transcaucasia. In 1936, Beria poisoned Lakoba at dinner. A year later, all Lakoba's relatives were wiped out. When Stalin summoned Beria to Moscow, he came without hesitation. Installed as Yezhov's deputy, he immediately seized control. On December the 9th, 1938, the press reported his appointment as head of the NKVD. Like his predecessor, Yagoda, Yezhov was denounced and disappeared, as well as the NKVD officers who had executed his orders, the same glorious sons of the motherland who had recently been recognized in the Kremlin. Beria hinted at a warmer political climate. Several dozen Gulag prisoners were released, among them Konstantin Rokossovsky, Andrei Tupolev, and Lev Landau. But new prisoners took their place. Among Stalin's victims was his recent favorite, the leader of the Komsomol, Alexander Kossarov. For Soviet youth, there is nothing more valuable in life than our great Bolshevik Communist Party and our dear, beloved comrade Stalin. Kossarov, a paragon of loyalty, was suddenly condemned for the Komsomol's failure to assist the NKVD in exposing enemies. In November 1938, Beria personally arrested him in his home. 3 months later, Kosarev was executed. Beria's victims included theater director Vsevolodymyr Hold, accused of supporting Trotsky and spying for 4 foreign countries. He never returned from prison. His wife, actress Zinaida Reich, was stabbed to death by the NKVD killers. Journalist Mikhail Koltsov and writer Isaac Babel were accused of anti-Soviet pro-Trotsky activities and shot. Prior to their execution, the NKVD had interrogated them, trying to gather incriminating evidence against other prominent intellectuals. Writers Boris Pasternak, Yuri Olesha, Ilya Ehrenberg, and composer Dmitry Shostakovich. The secret police prepared another show trial. Beria's warmer political climate did not prevent the torture of prisoners. Beria personally participated. Surreptitiously, bread trucks carried the bodies of those who died to the crematorium. Their ashes were dumped in the fields of a collective farm near Moscow. In 1940, Beria supervised the operation to kill Trotsky, Stalin's most hated enemy. The NKVD recruited Ramon Mercader. The Spaniard attacked Trotsky with an ice axe in his study in Mexico City. On August the 21st, Trotsky died. After Mercader had served 20 years in a Mexican prison, he was awarded the Golden Star of Hero of the Soviet Union. He died in Cuba in 1978 and was buried in Moscow as Ramon Ivanovich Lopez. In August 1940, the NKVD began to purge the recently annexed Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. During October, those suspected of anti-Soviet sentiments were exiled. Others followed in 1941 and then in 1944. More than 700,000 people. The USSR was on the brink of war. Military intelligence was the province of Commissar for Defense Semyon Timoshenko. But it was Beria who had the most up-to-date information about the impending Nazi invasion. He and Stalin are responsible for the military catastrophe of 1941. Stalin refused to acknowledge Hitler's plans to attack, and Beria intentionally ignored mounting evidence. Even a few hours before the Nazi assault, Beria complained to Stalin that spies were trying to sow panic. The war produced more work for the NKVD, but did not change their methods. Immediately after the war began, trains transported more prisoners to the Gulag. Their offenses were different: spreading rumors or creating panic, failure to surrender radio receivers and radio parts. Also incarcerated were soldiers who had survived encirclement. civilians from occupied territories, and those who had been German prisoners of war. In 1943, entire ethnic groups within Russia were accused of collaboration with the Germans. Russian Germans, Kalmyks, Chechens, and others were resettled in the wilderness of Siberia, Kazakhstan, and the far north. They were followed by the Crimean Tatars in 1944. Just behind the front lines, the NKVD formed Smersh killer squadrons with unlimited authority to execute traitors, deserters, and anyone who retreated. The NKVD had combat units as well. Sabotage battalions operated behind enemy lines. The NKVD directed resistance groups and guerrilla units in enemy-occupied territory. In 1943, the Germans uncovered a mass grave of Polish officers in the Katyn forest near the town of Smolensk. The NKVD was accused. After Smolensk was liberated, Beria appointed a board of investigation to determine that the Poles were executed by the Germans, even if it meant concealing evidence. At the time, the Western Allies wanted to preserve their relationship with the Soviet Union and avoided the matter. Only recently, documents from the NKVD archives proved beyond doubt that the Polish officers were murdered in 1940 on Beria's direct order. He also ordered executions of Polish prisoners at the camps near Kalinin and Kharkov. A total of more than 22,000 Polish officers died. As the war was coming to an end, there were more than 2 million German POWs in Russia. The NKVD had to utilize this workforce. But they were only a fraction of the slave laborers used for the most urgent and difficult construction projects. Most were Soviet convicts. Their numbers were constantly increasing. Returnees from German POW camps were sent to the Gulag. Stalin commended Beria and his officers. Beria was awarded the orders of Lenin and the Red Banner. For the resettlement of the North Caucasian and Crimean nations, he received the highest award for a military commander, the Order of Suvorov. He also was made a hero of socialist labor. Shortly after the war, Beria, who had been to the front only twice, became Marshal of the Soviet Union. He accompanied Stalin to the Potsdam Conference and was assigned to inspect the factories of defeated Germany. Stalin continued to promote him. In 1946, Beria concentrated on his work in the Politburo and Foreign Ministry. At the same time, heading the Ministry of State Security. He was assigned to supervise nuclear research. The terror continued under Beria's loyal subordinates. Dekhanosov, Goglidze, Merkulov. Another purge was planned, in part to liquidate the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. After the Nazi invasion, Stalin had ordered a meeting of representatives of the Jewish people in Moscow. Actor Solomon Michoels, writer Ilya Ehrenberg, and other famous Jewish intellectuals had appealed to brothers throughout the world to help the USSR fight Nazism. Their appeal was heard. In the US, the Jewish Council for Aid to Russia was formed and headed by Albert Einstein. After the war, the committee was unnecessary. In January 1948, its chairman, Solomon Michoels, was sent to Minsk to review theater performances, accompanied by an art expert from the NKVD. Michoels never returned from the trip. He died in a car crash. Many other committee members were arrested. Some died during the following 3 years of interrogations. The rest were executed in 1952. In the late 40s, Beria prepared to expand his power base. The task was made more difficult when his closest ally, Georgy Malenkov, fell from Stalin's favor and lost his position as Central Committee Secretary. This promoted Andrei Zhdanov, Beria's primary rival, and his faction gained key positions. But in 1948, Zhdanov died suddenly. Malenkov resumed his former position. Together, Beria and Malenkov could control all other party officials and thus the entire country. Only Stalin had greater power. But on March 1st, 1953, Stalin had a stroke and died soon after at his dacha. On March the 9th, Beria gave a eulogy from the Lenin Mausoleum, indicating that he was the next party leader. Beria attempted to consolidate his power. He made Malenkov chairman of the Council of Ministers. At Malenkov's suggestion, state security personnel were combined with the police under the Ministry of Home Affairs, headed by Beria. Beria planned to eliminate his rivals in the party elite: Molotov, Voroshilov, Kaganovich, Mikoyan, Bulganin, and Khrushchev, and secretly placed his men on alert. The plan failed. Beria's 2 deputies, Sergei Kruvlov and Ivan Serov, betrayed him and informed Nikita Khrushchev of the impending coup. Khrushchev bested Beria and quickly won the support of all the Central Committee leaders, Malenkov and Defense Minister Deputy Georgy Zhukov in particular. On Khrushchev's order, Beria was arrested in the Kremlin on June the 26th, 1953. Half a year later, he was executed. 3 months later, Khrushchev appointed Ivan Serov as first chairman of a new institution that would achieve worldwide notoriety. The State Security Committee, the KGB. Under its new title, the Soviet Security Service would function for almost 4 more decades in the tradition of the Cheka, the OGPU, and the NKVD.